I'm part of an international commission of experts and people from civil society concerned about the reform of multinational corporations. And we called for a minimum tax of at least 25%. Tax competition is the idea that countries try to attract businesses to their shores by offering them tax breaks. The problem is that when each country does that, the others respond, and it becomes a race to the bottom. It's a race to the bottom in which the only winner is actually the businesses. Because as one country lowers the tax, then the other country, and then a third, taxes get lower and lower. And you can see where this is going to go as each country competes by lowering the tax. There's only one place where this stops, and it's zero, or in some cases even beyond zero. You could actually pay companies to come to your jurisdiction. But that means that the burden of providing for basic public services on which everybody depends, and even including the corporations who played this game, the burden of that has to rest elsewhere, in particular on workers, workers who can't choose in general where they can live. So over the last decades, this kind of destructive tax competition has been at work. Ironically, as I said, the winners are the corporations, not the countries, and even less the citizens of the country, because they inevitably lose. It became very clear, I think, early on in the process of modern globalization, this risk of tax competition and a race to the bottom. The problem was that the globalization agenda in all of its dimensions was really driven by corporations. And the corporations were worried about double taxation. They liked tax competition. They just didn't want to be taxed twice. And so the result of that was there were a large number of agreements around the world between different countries to be sure that no company was taxed twice. But there was no agreement that they should be taxed at least once. And what came out of that was not only this race to the bottom, but a proliferation of what are being called tax havens, places where firms could locate to escape taxation, because in many jurisdictions, the race to the bottom wasn't happening fast enough. Those concerned about developing countries became increasingly worried. Countries needed the revenues in order to grow. They have so limited sources of revenue. And you can really see the consequences of the deprivation of the revenues that come from these tax avoidance, this tax competition. It means that they will lack resources with which to grow, with which to get out of the mire of poverty, with which to provide the basics for their citizens. They have very few alternatives. So for them, for the developing world, this tax competition is in many cases a matter of life and death. It's a vivid situation where a few rich individuals and corporations get a little bit richer in the north, and many people in the developing world suffer enormously. Some will actually die. A pivotal moment may have been in 2015 when the UN had a meeting in Addis Ababa called Finance for Development. At that point, it was clear that the commitments for financial support for development that the leading countries of the world have made, the G7, to say they were going to give 0.7% of their GDP to support development, that was all a sham, and it was clear that that money was not going to be forthcoming. The countries had to generate the money themselves. And the way they generated money was, of course, taxation. But the system of by which corporations, multinational corporations, could escape effectively taxation meant they were having increasing difficulties of even raising revenues from the corporations that were operating within their jurisdiction. The companies would claim that the real source of profits was somewhere else. The other pivotal moment was the 2008 financial crisis, because at that moment, even advanced countries were in desperate need for money, and they realized that many of the corporations that were within their jurisdictions were not paying taxes. They were using this system to siphon off money, in effect, to make sure that they escaped taxation. So at a particular moment, it became clear that both it was in the interest of both the developed and developing countries to do something about this race to the bottom, to do something about the tax havens which were being used by corporations to avoid taxation. And thus began a global initiative to stop this kind of tax avoidance activity, to create an international tax regime which would make sure that corporations paid their fair share of taxes, and they paid their fair share of taxes in the jurisdictions in which the economic activity occurred. Addressing a problem like tax competition requires countries to collaborate together, to work together in their common interest. We've created a number of multinational institutions like the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF, which facilitate that kind of cooperation. But in the end, it's up to the individual countries to make the relevant decisions. The international organizations are basically forum that bring people together, and they can only be as effective as the cooperation they can get from the member states. The problem has been that a couple of countries, particularly the United States, has not been very cooperative. It, not a surprise, has seen is under the influence of the multinational corporations. You saw it in the tax bill that was passed in December of 2017, which lowered the taxes for American corporations across the board at a time when inequality in America was increasing more and more, where the problem was really the growth of inequality made so apparent by this pandemic. And yet the tax bill that was passed raised the taxes when it was fully implemented, on a majority of those in the middle in order to finance a tax cut for the rich multinational corporations. The high-tech companies in the United States, which have been an important source of the growth of the stock market, have been particularly agile in taking advantage of the difficulties of imposing digital taxation and moving money around the world, and so they too have been at the forefront of tax avoidance. And so, with the United States, corporations that are so much the beneficiary of tax avoidance having so much influence in our politics, it is not a surprise that it has been difficult to get the kind of international cooperation that we need. While the international institutions are only provide a forum for bringing people together, and the ultimate decision has to rest with individual countries, how the voices of different countries are heard depends very much on how those discussions are organized. The OECD was originally founded as a think tank of the advanced countries. And while in the discussions of tax competition and what was called the BEPS initiatives, the base erosion and profit shifting, which is the technical name for tax avoidance, while they broadened this to include many other countries, there is a perspective that says, really, this is something that all countries ought to have a stake in, and that the appropriate place in which international cooperation on tax matters ought to be done in the tax committee of the UN. And that necessitated elevating the nature of that tax committee. I'm very sympathetic with the view that we need international organizations in which the voice of all the countries are heard. And so I would like us going forward to have more of the discussions to occur within the context of the United Nations. But this is a topic which is so important that I think that in any arena in which we can make progress, we should grab. And there are a number of arenas going on, a lot of cooperation going on, the IMF, the OECD, civil society, and I really remain hopeful that given the enormous needs for finance and funds in this post-pandemic world, that we will make progress at last on this very important topic. Just like 2008 was a moment where all the countries of the world, the advanced countries as well as the developing countries, realized that they needed more revenue, and a world in which the richest companies and the richest individuals could avoid taxation through this multinational globalization of moving money around in ways so that you could avoid or evade taxes was unacceptable. I think the needs for money are going to be so much larger in the post-pandemic world. The amount that the countries around the world are spending are orders of magnitude greater. The debt to GDP ratios have been rising in an unprecedented way in country after country. And so the need for tax revenues has never been more apparent. And I believe, will be totally unacceptable that those who are most able to pay will use globalization to avoid their social responsibility. I'm optimistic that we will make progress in getting an international agreement to stop this race to the bottom, this kind of tax competition. Now, it's not going to be easy because in the discussions that went on before the pandemic, while there was a broad agreement in many of the high-level principles, when it came to actually converting these into detailed actions, very little was done. There was talk, for instance, about a global minimum corporate tax rate, but the kinds of numbers that were bandied down was it was part of the race to the bottom. The corporations, ironically, were trying to use the opportunity of this discussion of a minimum tax to actually convert it from that to a discussion of a maximum tax and drive the tax down further, lower, even faster. One of the areas in which global tax competition would be very, very helpful would be in instituting environmental taxes. Taxes to encourage the world to shift to a greener world, to avoid fossil fuels. This is an area where, again, we don't want and we cannot allow tax competition. Some countries have been very forceful, global leadership in raising carbon taxes. And the worry has always been that exactly the same kind of tax competition that we've been seeing will take place, and other countries will try to attract the dirty businesses away from the countries that have imposed a carbon tax. If that happens, of course, the world won't get greener, the world will get dirtier. This is one of the very ugly aspects of tax competition today. So there needs to be a global agreement about green taxation, and that means taxing fossil fuels, regulating fossil fuels everywhere in the world. The elimination of tax competition is important for another reason. We're all in this together. We were all in. Everybody in the world has experienced the effects of the pandemic. Everybody in the world will experience the effects of climate change. In order to fight climate change, we are going to need to make heavy investments, green investments, they're sometimes called. The advanced countries have the resources to do it. The less developed countries don't. And so there's a sense in which unless we do something about this tax competition, it will become very difficult for the less developed countries to make the green investments that all the world needs if we're going to move through to the green transition.